I wish to seize upon this opportunity to congratulate the Department of English at the Faculty of Letters and Humanities of Kairouan upon the renewed habilitation of the MA program. I wish to thank the organizers of this conference for their hospitality and for the pleasure they gave me to meet very dear friends of mine. Thank you indeed. The title of my presentation is Pragmatic License. Are we dealing with a case of strategic hybridity? I wish to argue that hybridity of text and context refers to the complex and not necessarily compatible factors affecting meaning assignment in verbal interaction. It militates against a strictly formalist, truth-conditional, compositional view of meaning assignment and revisits the opaque relationship between language and reality. I wish to submit an explanatory principle that seeks to account for the complexity of meaning assignment within a fundamentally pragmatic vantage point. So, pragmatic license is a form of strategic hybridity that is inherent in verbal interactions among language users. Its underlying principle is making allowance for, behaving as if, for apparent deviations from norms for the sake of a more effective communication act. The term is coined in analogy with poetic license. It seeks to explain how people manage to act on one another by manipulating calculated impressions and how they manage to interpret these apparent deviations. Pragmatic license is pervasive and affects all our linguistic choices and discursive strategies. I have noticed a number of dichotomies from various disciplines. For example, in literary criticism, the distinction between mimesis and diegesis. In narratology, the distinction between point of view, narrative voice, vocalization. In psychology, the distinction between public self and private self. In sociology, appearance versus reality, and I'll be talking about theatricality versus habitus. In pragmatics, saying versus implying, saying versus doing. Linguistic meaning versus speaker's intended meaning. In cinematography, notions of dialogism and decentering self. In critical theory, polyphony, heteroglossia. In historiography, any historical account is necessarily mediated. In media studies, agenda setting, framing strategies. And in rhetoric, persuasion, manipulation, and deception. Now, what these concepts show is that what is presented need not be taken at its face value. These dichotomies are possible because the various signifying systems, be they linguistic, social, or semiotic, have made them possible. Trying to synchronize these three elements, expression, expressivity, and intention, with the addressee's interpretation is yet another problem. There are different ways of reading a text, and there is no way we can constrain what the reader addressee is going to highlight in his or her interpretation. There is no way we can control the reader's interpretations of the text. One can guide or frame the reader towards a particular understanding, but there is no guarantee that the reader will inevitably follow the path that one has selected for him or her. You can influence but never determine the reader's response. Now I move to a distinction that is well known in pragmatics between emotional involvement or detachment on the one hand and emotive or strategic involvement or detachment on the other hand. The distinction goes back to the German philosopher Anton Marti, who talks about various ways of showing involvement and detachment. For example, this can be done through auditory perception, shouting, crying, giggling, the use of a low voice volume with a low pitch. It can be a threatening sign, or the use of a high pitch. Visual perception, facial expressions, the use of gestures that can show different degrees of involvement or detachment. Tactile expressions, the different ways of shaking people's hands, showing cold or welcoming. On many occasions, people show a degree of involvement or detachment because it serves the social rituals of a particular situation. That is to say, for example, when expressing condolences, we are meant to express empathy even if we are not particularly touched or sad. However, society dictates that upon us. Social appropriateness shows the type of involvement or detachment that is required. For example, in an oral exam, a teacher is supposed to be cool and neutral. This is dictated by ethical codes of being a teacher. What is interesting about Marty's distinction is that there is always this possibility of a mismatch or gap between what people show and what they hide. This mismatch is one of the pillars of pragmatics. Emotional involvement is indebted to Jacobson's expressive function. According to Roman Jacobson, the expressive function is I-centered. In other words, the presence of the speaker is very prominent in this kind of function. The focus is on the I of the speaker, on the self of the speaker, on the ego. In the expression, oh my God, the function is expressive. In any kind of expletive like dear me or in curses or interjections, the function is I-centered. What Jacobson has failed to show, however, is whether this outburst of feelings literally reflects our true feelings, that is to say, true involvement, or whether it is strategic. This is not something that is discussed deeply in Jacobson's framework, but it is of special importance in pragmatics and CBA. In other words, when you show involvement, how do we know that the ostensible degree of involvement literally reflects your true feelings, or whether you have done it on purpose because it served your purposes? In other words, if someone tells you a story and the context dictates that you show some kind of involvement, the social principle of tact requires that you show a high degree of involvement, sympathy, for example. This is not hypocrisy, but the social principle of tact requires that showing some degree of involvement can be strategic. The same thing can be true of detachment. Sometimes, even if you are not very involved, you are called upon to show detachment because the social context in which you operate dictates a high degree of detachment. Caffey and Janney wrote about emotional versus emotive involvement. Their argument is actually very interesting because what matters in pragmatics is not the emotional side of involvement, because emotional involvement has to do with catharsis, with an outpour of feelings, purgation through this outpour of feelings. If you have a pragmatic frame of mind, you take it with a pinch of salt. You say, this is what the speaker has shown in a particular context. In other words, instead of saying the writer is involved, you would say, the writer has shown signs of involvement here, or the speaker has shown signs of involvement or detachment there. If you talk about emotional involvement, you take it on board, you adopt it. This will lead to the notion of acting. Acting as a theatrical manipulation of impressions. If you take signs of involvement as impressions, as clues left on the surface of the discourse, the impressions reveal a high degree of involvement or detachment. You need not take them for their face value. Always take them with a pinch of salt. In general, we think that kids are spontaneous, more or less natural. In other words, they are angry. If they are angry, this is going to be shown. Whereas adults tend to be more sophisticated. What they feel is not necessarily shown in the way shown by kids. So the more mature you are, the greater your acting capacity is going to be. Maturity is associated with the ability to act. In other words, by acting, you mean the ability to manipulate impressions so as to serve your purposes on that particular occasion. Here we deal with the notion of social appropriateness or expediency. In other words, you say that the author or the speaker is being involved here because it is expedient, it is appropriate, it is convenient at that particular juncture to be seen as involved. This is an idea of camera consciousness or other consciousness. There is a principle in legal studies saying that it is not important to implement justice, it's more important to be seen as implementing justice, to be perceived as implementing justice. By analogy, it's not really important whether you truly or literally feel biased or detached. What is more important from a pragmatic perspective is how you are going to be seen by others. It is this consciousness of the gaze of others. This is the other consciousness. An excellent actor is someone who strikes you as totally natural. This idea was developed by Goffman. It was Goffman who focused particularly on self-marketing strategies. Of course, the self-marketing strategies are not restricted to the notion of involvement. In the literal framework of Goffman, these self-marketing strategies have to do with framing. The frame that you are going to adopt in marketing your own image to the others. You present yourself in a as a generous person, as an intellectual, as a nonchalant person, a gay-spirited person, as à la mode. You portray a certain image of yourself that fits within a certain frame. This is a little contribution of Goffman. Here we are using Goffman's insight to develop this notion of emotional versus emotive involvement. People are good or bad actors depending on their ability to adapt the ostensive degree of involvement or detachment to the requirement dictated by the occasion. The greater this ability to adapt, the greater the acting potential, the more efficient they are going to be. Another term for emotive involvement is strategic, calculated, expedient, or utilitarian involvement. Now, the manifestations of écart between what people say and what they nurture inside. The contribution of rhetoric has aided the evolvement of this écart. Some concepts pertaining to rhetoric divulge this in a number of ways. Words like écart, glissement, énalage presuppose that there is some kind of departure from the norm. So here I go to Marty's distinction and make up the initial foundations of the distinction. So pragmatics is based on this very dichotomy of norm versus departure from the norm. And this is revealed through a number of distinctions that are well known. For example, literal versus figurative meaning, the use of metaphors, the use of metonymy, zeugma, deceptive sense of transfer to ensure objectivity, various meanings of displacement. For example, displacement in terms of number, the use of tu versus vous in French, displacement in terms of gender, inclusion versus exclusion, displacement in terms of space, here and there, in terms of time, the now versus then, and so on. Irony, for example, is a very good example of this décalage or écart. Where in irony we have a mismatch between expression and context, which is known as contextual irony. If someone fails to answer you say to him, how intelligent. This is ironical because it is not in keeping with context. Here we have a mismatch between expression and context. You could have a mismatch between expression and expressivity. You could talk about dramatic irony or cosmic irony and various other types of irony. Polyphony, for example, is another concept that is very relevant here. It's a key term in irony. In general, we may have a voice that apparently says something and another voice that undermines it. This is the essence of irony. Irony is a subtle way of insinuating things, especially when we deal with irony based on literary and cultural allusions. Ventriloquizing is another example of polyphony that leads to irony. Ventriloquizing can happen in language. When you mimic somebody's tone or voice or typical lexical repertoire, typical structures or typical way of talking. By echoing somebody else's voice, you are poking fun at this person. Compared to sarcasm, irony is the most sophisticated device. The notion of heteroglossia, the notion of banter, the notion of the baroque, the notion of farce or parody, all of these notions are based on the same dichotomy between what you say and what you hint at. Euphemism versus dystrophism. Again, you know, we have this mismatch between reality and language. Why do we have displacement? We can have displacement for various reasons. Some of these reasons are psychological, like showing interest versus lack of interest. Some of these are social. For example, when you say, "I was wondering if you could kindly help me," there is a maxim known as a tact maxim, which says that you mustn't impose on others. "I was wondering if you could help" is an oxymoron. Apparently contradictory terms appear in conjunction. First of all, because we have a speech act of requesting. It is one important felicity condition for speech acts, which is the necessity of making the act at the time of speaking. Otherwise, it can't be taken as a speech act. For you to make a speech act of requesting, the request must be made at the time of speaking. Otherwise, it's not a speech act. There is a presumption of presence when you make a speech act. You can't make a speech act unless it is made at the time of speaking. Otherwise, it doesn't count as a speech act. So here we have a problem between "I was wondering" and between the request. The reason for displacement is that this use of the past apparently negates the speech act. By using the past, you are saying, "I'm not asking," but you are asking. This is a rhetorical figure. It's a trope, because you are apparently negating what you are asking through the use of the past tense. And in fact, by asking, you are making the request public, since you've made it. So you've made what you apparently have negated. What is the jury or publicly announced is a negation. You're not going to do it. But what is de facto, what is stated already despite your negation, is that you said it. So despite the use of the past, which apparently negates the request or the speech act, you have made the speech act by asking. So there is something that is negated at the time of speaking. You say something despite the fact that you negate it. The IWC is not going to say that this is a contradiction, because he knows that you do that because it's a form of displacement, and displacement here is for politeness purposes. I move on to government's concept of the self. Government wants to show how even the most innocuous or apparently authentic of our social acts can be calculated to show the actor to his or her audience in a favorable light. Government sociology is one of co-presence, of what happens when people are in one another's presence. It's a special theory that dwells upon the episodic and sees life only as it is lived in a narrow interpersonal circumference, ahistorical and non-institutional, an existence beyond history and society, and one which comes alive only in the fluid, transient encounter. There is communicated a sense of precariousness of the world, at the same time of zest in managing oneself in it. Rather than conceiving of activities as a set of interlocking functions, government's dramaturgical model advances the view in which social life is systematically regarded as an elaborate form of drama, and in which, as in the theater, men are all striving to project a convincing image of self to others. Here, men are not viewed as trying to do something, but as trying to be something. Government thus declares a moratorium on the conventional distinction between make-believe and reality, between cynical and sincere. Human conduct is seen as essentially concerned with fostering and maintaining a specific conception of self before others. The outcome of this effort, moreover, is not seen as depending on what men really do in the world, or on their real social functions, or on their real worth, but on their ability to skillfully mobilize convincing props, settings, fronts, and manners. The same applies, this of the dichotomy applies to our understanding of modals. For example, in epistemic modality, we have ostensive commitment or ostensive lack of commitment to the truth of the proposition. In other words, if somebody gives us signs of certainty, we're not going to say he or she is certain. We're going to say he or she is giving us deliberate impressions of certainty that may or may not be true. The same is true of deontic modality, relating to expressions of duty, obligation, and so on. We are talking about ostensive degrees of coercion or lack of obligation. Evaluative modality is the same, ostensive neutrality or ostensive expression of stance. Evidential modality is the same, ostensive knowledge or lack of knowledge of the source of information. For de Saussure, not the old one, but a recent de Saussure, fuzziness is not restricted to vague terms, complicated sentences, and overuse of metaphors. On the contrary, de Saussure avers that among the most important strategies used within manipulative discourses is the creation of a global fuzziness, so much so that even parts of the discourse that seem clear and simple lead to interpretive problems for the addressee. 6 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to argue that there is another dimension which is very important, or it needs to be taken into consideration, which is the strategic or persuasive dimension. People can opt for various types of displacement for strategic purposes, in order to persuade, in order to bring about the desired effect. Just look at the language of advertisements or the language of politics and so on. I want to take one single instance, important instance of manipulation, which involves blocking of one's rational device. As has been cogently argued by de Saussure, and also Triki and Talman, 1994, a number of strategies inform the process of manipulation in order to block access to the truth and make difficult the likelihood and acceptability of checking, as well as consistency checking. All of these dimensions are based on the necessity of blocking the identification of the manipulative intention of the speaker. Consequently, for de Saussure, manipulation is a case covertly transmitted information leading to the blocking of one's rational device in such a way that certain operations about beliefs are accomplished by the manipulated person himself. By introducing through its characteristic individual configurations a disjunction between deictic and modal applications, a person in a large reveals simultaneously both tension and resolution of these viewpoints. Now, the same is true of deixis. In a paper I published on deixis, I tried to argue that deixis is central to pragmatics as it signals access to the contextual schemata. I argued that deixis involves a complex and opaque relationship between language and reality. The speaker's beliefs and worldviews determine which deictic expressions to use. The collective patterns of face, politeness, and cultural norms dictate some preferences in the selection of deictic categories. Complex psychological and social factors may be at stake in the choice of deixis. Footing, framing, and theatricality are key concepts borrowed from government to account for the manipulative dimension of deixis. Deixis is also governed by generic constraints, and all of this are connected by a connecting thread that I will refer to later on at the end of my paper. So what they show is an oblique relationship between language and reality. And also Van Dyck here argues that contexts are necessarily subjective. All pragmatic accounts deal with the complexity of meaning assignment. The problem comes from the interaction between the following: expression, expressivity, and intention that is attributed to the speaker, interpretation that is attributed to the reader or addressee. The link between these four elements is not necessarily automatic. In other words, expression does not necessarily match expressivity. In other words, expressivity in terms of voice or in terms of pitch, in terms of kinesics or movements and so on, if the message is oral, or in writing in terms of underlying use of letter size, using graphics and so on, does not necessarily match expression. The relationship between the two can be oblique. You can say something and undermine it through expressivity. And this is already problematic. It does not necessarily correlate with the speaker's intention. In other words, what you state is one thing, and what you intend is not necessarily the same. The main insight, as far as Grice is concerned, is that people manage to pass on implied meanings by deliberately flouting or violating some of the maxims. In other words, if I, as a reader, try to cooperate or observe the cooperative principle, I will give you, as a speaker, the benefit of the doubt. I will assume that this flouting of the maxim is not a sign of lack of competence. It's something done on purpose, and your mastery of language is beyond doubt. Therefore, I'll not take it as a sign of any lapse. I will take it as a deliberate strategy, and I think that you are inviting me through the flouting of the maxims to look elsewhere. You are telling me, look, the stated meaning is not what you are looking for, please look elsewhere. There is a kind of conspiracy here, a hidden dialogue between the addressee and the speaker, so that the addressee, in order to conspire with the speaker, will get the wink. Okay, I got the message and I will look elsewhere. Elsewhere means some implied meaning other than the stated literal meaning. However, there are a number of complications to the picture. Maxims often conflict with one another, so that some maxims are observed at the expense of other maxims. Under contextual constraints, some maxims will simply override other maxims. In fact, as Leach has cogently pointed out, all the Gricean maxims can be overridden by some maxims of politeness. Here I talk about the input of pragmatics, language used as social action, various types of meaning in pragmatics, saying versus doing, and all the input of speech act theory. Multifaceted speech acts, micro acts versus micro acts. So to wrap up, an attempt has been made to show that the terror of the contribution of linguistics lies in capitalizing on the intricate and complex relations between intention at the enunciating level and impression at the énoncé or utterance level. There simply is no one-to-one correlation between these two levels of analysis. In terms of the hypothesis that I will spell out at the end, this orientation in linguistic thinking takes enunciating as acting in the sense of the art of creating and giving impressions. In other words, within this framework, enunciating means manipulating impressions and strategically laying them bare on the surface of the utterance. I use here what I called in Triki and Salem Makhlouti 2002 the Triki hypothesis. Language use is a form of social acting. The pun on the word social acting capitalizes on its three most important meanings. First, acting is theatrically defined as the art of creating and giving impressions. Second, acting could be construed in the sense of conforming to canonized social or discursive norms, where speakers and hearers are called upon to participate in a coded game which has its rituals. And finally, acting is defined in terms of acting on people, that is, affecting their lives and beliefs. In terms of Triki hypothesis, each meaning of acting borrows the tools of the other meanings of the word. And here, I propose these four maxims, part of the Triki hypothesis. First maxim, the verbal interaction as game maxim. Every act of verbal interaction is part and parcel of a calculated game. Second maxim, the dissimulation maxim. The game is realized through the wearing of appropriate or convenient masks. The third maxim is the relevance maxim. This play on masks is governed by the principle of relevance. And the fourth maxim, known as the stakes maxim. Relevance is relative to the stakes of verbal interaction as perceived